A few quick words of introduction. This film is a recording of a talk given by Keith Scobie-Youngs, who's the principal of the Cumbria Clock Company. That's him over there. Cumbria Clock Company is based in the north of England and specialises in conservation work on turret and other public clocks. Because of limitations on meeting during May 2020, the talk was delivered as a video conference, of which this is a recording by the meeting host. This turned out very well. The meeting had vastly more in attendance than would have normally been able to come. We even had visitors from the west coast of USA and such wild and remote realms as the Outer Hebrides and Cambridge University. The British Horological Institute, or BHI, is an educational body in the UK that awards accreditation for watchmakers and clockmakers, and also publishes the peer-reviewed Horological Journal. The BHI has groups of members around the UK called branches who meet from time to time. This talk was delivered to the North London branch on the 20th of May 2020. We hope you enjoy it.
Right, good evening, everybody. I must admit as being a little bit more nervous about doing this lecture this way in my front room with my dog than if I was doing it in front of everybody at a venue somewhere. With this lecture, there's a lot of facts and details, and I'm going to have to read it. My memory isn't as good as it used to be. And so sitting here in my front room reading something to myself does feel a little bit strange, but we'll give it a go, and hopefully you'll enjoy the story. This is all about Aynsworth Thwaites and the beginning of Thwaites and Reed, and it's been something I've been passionate about for many years. And so over the last 15 years, I've taken a big interest in Aynsworth himself, and kind of come up with this lecture, which I first delivered with the AHS in the London Lecture Series in January. Little of it's changed, but we can go from there. So, 226 years ago, less than 5 minutes walk away from where we would have been having this meeting in the Calthorpe Arms in Gray's Inn Road, in St James's Church, Clerkenwell, one of the most remarkable clockmakers was buried at the age of 75. His name was Aynsworth Thwaites. In those 75 years, he laid the foundations to what turned out to become one of the country's largest and most successful turret clock manufacturers of the time. But it's these formative years that I will be discussing tonight, and also hopefully correcting some of the dates and other information which is often quoted and published on the internet and many publications. Many of you will be aware that a large part of Aynsworth's business was the manufacture and repair of domestic clocks, along with other objects. I will later discuss these to a small extent, but my main focus is on his turret clock work. Aynsworth was born in 1719 in the parish of Merton, Surrey, and in 1735, at the age of 16, he was bound to the clockmaker Benjamin Bradley, the son of the eminent turret clockmaker Langley Bradley. Well, no, something's not going on. Oh, we'll go for that. The story of Langley Bradley was extensively researched by Bryn Hodgson, who wrote an excellent 3-part article, A Judicious Workman, that was published in the AHS in 2002, and the source of much of my information about Langley Bradley. However, it is important that we understand a little about his early days and how he built his business before I go on to discuss Aynsworth's remarkable career. By the time Aynsworth was apprenticed to Benjamin Bradley, Langley Bradley was 60 years old and would appear to be in the process of passing his business on to his son, Benjamin Bradley. Langley had had a remarkable career. He'd worked closely with Christopher Wren on several of the city's finest churches, such as St Magnus the Martyr on Upper Thames Street in 1709. In 1711, he manufactured and stored a clock at Hampton Court Palace to drive the ever-troublesome astronomical dial, and manufactured the wonderful clock as can be seen in this slide in the Townsend Tower of Blenheim Palace in 1710. But without doubt, the jewel in his crown was the clock he built and installed at St. Paul's Cathedral in 1707. Sadly, this clock was removed when the existing Smith of Derby masterpiece was installed in 1893. And all we have is this sketch by in J.W. Benson's book, Time and Timeteller, along with the original specification supplied by Langley Bradley, that leaves us in no doubt what a mechanism it must have been. And I'll read the specification. The frame of the clock to be made of new iron, in height 6 feet, in length 8 foot 7 inches, and in depth 2 foot 6 inches, and the said frame to be well and sufficiently braced, the 4 corner pillars to be turned, and the base to be 4-inch square, and brass urns on top of the said pillars. All the wheels to be made of brass, the great wheels to be 2 foot 6 inches in diameter and about 1 2/3 inches in thickness. The second wheels to be 1 foot 6 in diameter and about 1 inch thick, and the third wheel to be 1 foot 3 inches in diameter and proportional in thickness. All the pinions to be hardened, all the holes wherein the pivots work to be stopped with hardened brass, collets to be turned on the foresaid, barrel caps to be brass and about 20 inches in diameter, to wind up brass wheels and hardened pinions. All the dial wheels, roundels, dial centres, dial work to be made of brass with a fair dial plate marked on the movement to show the hours, minutes and seconds within the tower. I've also found recently another reference in J.F. Kendall's book, A History of Watches and Other Timepieces, which confirms the description just quoted, but interestingly also informs us that the frame and the columns, rectangular base plate and the supporting entablature were made using cast iron, one of the first examples of this material being used in turret clock manufacture. And I think we can all agree it would have been a wonderful mechanism. A little bit more research is I'm doing on this subject, and it looks like when this was taken out, it was put in Thwaites and Reed's workshop for quite many years, where people would go and see it before it was scrapped for the war effort. But that's another story which I'm working on. But again, it's Langley Bradley's early days which we need to have to look into and understand how his expertise in turret clock horology developed and passed down to Aynsworth Thwaites. Langley Bradley was bound to Joseph Wise in 1687 at the age of 16. Joseph was the son of John Wise, who we know manufactured turret clocks, as he was one of the 4 clockmakers who competed for the manufacture of the clock at St Dunstan's in the West in 1671. He didn't win the contract, but he did go on to manufacture the clocks at St Dionysus in Fenchurch Street, St Sepulchre in Holborn in 1671, and possibly the oldest clock in the City of London, St James's Garlichide of 1683. Langley Bradley was freed in 1695, and it would appear it was then that he set out on his own, as William Derham, the author of The Artificial Clockmaker, is quoted as saying, "I owe much to the assistance of Langley Bradley, a judicious workman in Whitechapel who drew up a scheme of the clockmaker's language." Langley Bradley was without doubt a skilled clockmaker and experienced in the manufacture of turret clocks. But to be successful in business, you also need a bit of luck. And without going into too much detail, this came in the form of the marriage to Anne Wise, the widow of his master's brother, Thomas Wise, as it is thought that the arrangement could have been made whilst Thomas was ill, because Anne's remarriage took place only a few months after his death. In Thomas's will, along with a number of clocks and watches, etc., were a set of tools consisting of anvils, bellows, hammers, a beak iron, and several vices, with all the remainder of the working tools valued at £10. A beak iron is the type of anvil we most likely think of now, with the long tapering nose. This would have without doubt set Langley on his way into producing all the very fine turret clocks we have already mentioned. but back to Aynsworth, who was busily working away with Benjamin Bradley at the Minute Dial in Fenchurch Street, producing watches, clocks and turret clocks to the ever-growing Langley Bradley business. But as we have already discovered, in business, there's always an opportunity. And in Aynsworth Thwaites' case, this was the untimely death of Benjamin Bradley in 1744. Benjamin was Langley Bradley's only son, with whom he had been in business since 1728, and upon whom he must have relied, especially for the heavier turret clock work. Administration of his estate was granted to his father Langley Bradley, indicating that Benjamin had probably remained a bachelor. A year later, in 1745, at the age of 74, Langley Bradley moved to Mile End Green, and although he no longer retained the shop, he still serviced and maintained a number of turret clocks, including St Paul's Cathedral and his village church in St Dunstan's Mile End Green, and at his age would have no doubt needed assistance. Langley died aged 82 and was buried on the 4th of October, 1753. What I've done here is just an apprentice timeline of showing how Aynsworth Thwaites apprenticeship went. Peter Colson, John Wise, Joseph Wise, Langley Bradley, Benjamin Bradley, and then Aynsworth Thwaites. Personally, I think that it's highly likely that Aynsworth was working for Langley Bradley for at least 7 of those 9 years, as he was made free in 1751 and took on his first apprentice, William Jarvis, in the same year. His first turret clock contract that we know of is for this church at St Giles Cripplegate in 1752, for which he was paid £17. Funnily enough, it was Langley Bradley clock had been installed in 1722. By 1753, he was resident at Crowther's Well Alley in the parish of St Giles, and this is where I think he had his first workshops, indicating in red. If you look on the internet or Wikipedia or anywhere and all the others and several publications, it is stated that it was in 1740 that Aynsworth set up his workshops in Rosamond Street, Clerkenwell. We know that he did end up there, but it wasn't until much later, and we know this for the following reasons. In 1740, he was still bound to Benjamin Bradley. Between 1745 and 1752, his children, James, Benjamin, Anne and Thomas, were all baptised at St Luke's Church, Old Street, Finsbury, which would suggest he was living in that area. In 1753, we have copies of the land tax records showing he was living in Crowther's Well Alley, where without doubt he would have had his workshops, because in those days you didn't live in a different parish to where your workshops were and pay twice the rent. Perhaps the best bit of evidence, though, is the rock map, which is a famous map of 1746. And if you look at that map, Rosamond's Row or Rosamond Street didn't exist. So I'm fairly confident in saying that Crowther's Well Alley was where the story of Aynsworth Thwaites' self-employment starts, not Rosamond Street. As I've already stated, Langley Bradley dies in 1753, aged 82, and with no heir to his business empire. We have no idea what the relationship was between Langley Bradley and Aynsworth Thwaites at the time. All we know is that his estate was left to his daughter, Margaret Reynard. But who else in 1753 was setting up a workshop and needing tools? Especially tools from a man who bragged in 1730, "No one has made greater clocks of eminence than any person in and around London, and accordingly has more tools about him fit for that purpose." And that's what Langley Bradley said about himself. I find it hard to believe that, knowing what success Aynsworth was going to achieve, that all, or at least some of these tools, didn't end up in his possession. I would hazard a guess that all of Langley Bradley's customers would have been well acquainted with Aynsworth, and they wouldn't have taken much convincing that he would be the best person to look after their clocks now that Langley Bradley was dead, thereby giving Aynsworth a head start in his new business. This was certainly the case with the Royal Exchange, one of London's most prominent buildings, as by 1754 he was recorded at looking after this very troublesome clock that had caused Langley Bradley in 1743 to be admonished by the Gresham Committee for not taking care of his duties because of problems with the chimes. The clock, the original clock, was made by Edward Stanton and installed on Ladies' Day in 1671. Stanton went on to become the master of the Clockmakers Company in 1696. This was without doubt a very impressive clock for its time, as the Grand Gresham Committee demanded the following: a substantial workman-like clock, the bigness upon the square to be 5 foot, the height about 3 foot, the barrel of iron to be 3 foot in diameter with six tunes, such as shall be light of the rest of the work to be proportional for going of 30 hours, that it shall strike the quarters on 4 bells, and that it shall strike the hour, that it shall repeat at the half hour. This was probably one of the first clocks to use 4 quarter bells in England. Over the next 30 years, Aynsworth spent a considerable amount of time and supplied numerous reports and quotations for the necessary repairs and adjustments, all of which are still in the ownership of the Mercers Company. In 1786, Aynsworth manufactured and supplied a new clock with a set of chimes, and the details are in the day books. The clock itself cost £134. The tune playing machine, which played 7 tunes upon 8 bells, was £159. To paint the dials was £15. To fasten the bells to their stocks, £20, and making a contract worth £310. A large order in those days, and one which would have taken a considerable amount of time and space to complete. What is quite interesting is that in 1764, Aynsworth was commissioned by St. Michael's Church, Charleston, USA, to replicate the Stanton quarter chimes in a quarter clock, which are still in use today, sounding out across the city several thousand miles away from where the original one was once situated. The Royal Exchange clock was destroyed in a fire in 1838, and it is reported that the bells were heard playing while it was burning. There's nae luck about this house. I find that quite funny. Going back in time, another thing which has often been quoted, and if we're going to believe many sources of information, 1756 was the year that Aynsworth manufactured the clock for the Horse Guards in the city of Westminster, between Whitehall and Horse Guards Parade. However, some excellent work done by Brian Harwood, a retired household carryman, who has been researching the history of Horse Guards building, including the clocks. He discovered that in the records, the original clock was manufactured by Thomas Herbert, the Royal Clockmaker, between September 1663 and April 1664, and that many names occur in the records of keepers over the subsequent 80 or so years of its existence. The principal office holders appear to have been Edward East and his son James between 1663 and 1680, after which early relatives of the Seddon clockmaking family took over the work. Both the clock and bell are clearly depicted in the 1740s views of old horse guards painted by Canaletto during his tour of London. In 1752, John Davis, Sr., the Royal Clockmaker of Windsor and a turret clockmaker we all know, inspected the clock and reported that it was in very poor condition and gave a price to repair it for £60. Or if it was to strike the quarters and show the minutes, it would need to be replaced at a cost of £140. However, in 1753, Mr. Seddon, who had been looking after the clock for 60 years, presented himself to the board and explained that he could repair the original Thomas Herbert clock and make new motion works so it'd show the hours and minutes for a sum of £50. As you can imagine, the contract was awarded to was awarded to Mr. Seddon, and in 1753 the clock was given a new lease of life. And you can see here this wonderful picture by Canaletto as well of the scaffolding around the dial. I mean, getting a shed put up that high must have taken some work. Anyway, the clock, Mr. Seddon was given the job in 1753, and the clock was given a new lease of life up until it finally gave up. And it is then it was replaced by Aynsworth Thwaites in 1768 and not 1753, which is often reported. The new clock supplied by Aynsworth Thwaites, as seen in this photograph, is completely different from the Thomas Herbert clock that was reconditioned by Mr. Seddon. The main differences are that it has a ting-tang quarter chain, and also something not so evident, the use of cast iron in the construction of the clock frame itself. Cast iron, as I've already explained, is not often found in clocks of this period, but it was used by Langley Bradley in the construction of Blenheim Palace and in 1710, and also the massive clock at St. Paul's Cathedral. But a majority of his clocks were manufactured from wrought iron strip bar. So Aynsworth would have been aware of the material and used it when he built St. Michael's clock in 1764 in Charleston, and I am of the opinion that Aynsworth would have used cast iron on the larger clocks, as it would offer greater stability, as the end sections could be cast in one piece and the horizontal bars mortised into them. To drive large dials and strike big bells, you need a large turret clock. They require heavy weights, and any twisting of the frame needs to be avoided. Those who are familiar with the work of Benjamin Lewis Woolamy will notice his improvements, in inverted commas, to the horse guards clock. But thankfully, most of the installation remains the work of Aynsworth Thwaites. Without doubt, in 1768, this would have been the jewel in Aynsworth Thwaites' crown, and rightly so. So hopefully that puts the date that Aynsworth manufactured the clock. It was not 1753, but it was 1768. So let's go back to 1751, where we know that Aynsworth started his business in Crowther's Well Alley. We know that he had been made free of the Clockmakers Company in that year, but he had also employed his first apprentice, William Jarvis. In the following year, in 1752, he took on another two by the names of James Emery and Francis Jersey. In 1753, he took on a fourth, William Hudson. I would have a glass of water. So, if within the first 2 years of him being in business, he already had 4 apprentices, you would be led to believe that he had other experienced workmen working alongside them, with himself overseeing the whole operation. To employ so many clockmakers, he must have been undertaking a lot of work, and to be doing so early on in his self-employment makes me also believe that he must have come to some arrangement with Langley Bradley to take over his order book and perhaps purchase his tools, for the simple reasons a large workforce would use a large variety of tools. Moving forward and looking at his clocks, he did produce one thing I do find very, very interesting, is in respect to his turret clocks, is the simple fact that they were completely different in design of the frame from those produced by Langley Bradley. It is often thought and seen that an apprentice will copy his master's designs, and if we compare the designs of the corner posts and the frames of the Langley Bradley clock with those of his master Joseph Wise, you can see that they're very similar. This is a Wise family frame, and you can see the OG mouldings on the sides and the horns at the top. And this is a Langley Bradley clock, and you can see again that the 4 corner straps are incredibly similar. Whereas, and I'm sorry for the poor picture, but this is the one I have, whereas the Aynsworth Thwaites is completely different, and very distinctive and cannot be confused by any other maker. And this is that tulip design at the bottom and the top. I call it a tulip, but that's what it first feels to me. I've only got 2 examples of clocks which I'm confident are made by Aynsworth during this Crowtherswell Alley period, both for other clockmakers. One side Julian and the other side David Hubbard. You can see the tulip designs on this post. On the Hubbard clock you can see the same type of designs. What I also found very interesting about the David Hubbard clock is the handset dial. One side is marked out for the single hand and is signed David Hubbard circa 1750. And you can see that that's quite evident. On the other side, when you turn it over, it shows the hand set for minutes, engraved for minutes, with his name repeated alongside an explanation of the work undertaken in 1792 by Aynsworth and his son, John. I don't believe that this was to save money, because Aynsworth would have had a brass foundry. We know he had a brass foundry in his workshops, but perhaps in some way to pay homage to a previous customer. For whatever reason, I find it a nice touch. So now we come to the very important date in the history and development of Aynsworth Thwaites, the move from Crowtherswell Alley to the famous Rosamond Row address. This move must have taken place between 1757 and 1759, and my reason for this is that a certain John Thwaites, who has a large part to play later in the history of the company, was christened on the 7th of August 1757 at St Giles Church, Cripplegate. In 1759, on the 22nd of March, Elizabeth Thwaites was christened at St James's, Clerkenwell, a stone's throw from Rosamond Row. So we know that it was around this time that he moved with his family and set up his workshop in Clerkenwell, perhaps because the area was developing into a horological centre for London, or because there are a large number of trades, or more trades, which have been useful for him in the development of his own business. The earliest example of an Aynsworth Thwaite clock I have when he moved to Rosamond's Row is the one I've been told about by Andrew King, and is the clock from the Foundling School, Whitechapel. And the story is quite a saga. In 1749, William Smith, another very, very important and well-known turret clock manufacturer, was asked to submit designs for a turret clock of the finest specification, and after gaining Mr. Ellicott's approval in March 1749, submitted his proposals, which is accepted for the cost of £63. The committee agreed, but requested Mr. Ellicott to inspect the work, and in September 1750, William Smith was paid in full. However, by October 1758, 8 years later, the clock was giving trouble, and a certain William Harrison, the son of the famous John Harrison, was asked to inspect it, after which he said it cannot be repaired, which I find hard to believe, quotes for a new one at £40, as long as he can have the old one in part exchange. This is accepted, and in 1759, the new clock is installed, and the engraving on the handset dial reads, "Made by Aynsworth Thwaites, 1759, for William Harrison." This must have been one of the very first clocks out of Rosamond Row. The Foundling School was closed in 1926, and the clock removed by Thwaites and Reed, and finally installed at Ashland School, Berkhamsted. Hopefully it was still there. The next clock I have any details about, that was made soon after he moved into his new workshops, is this wonderful example made for Thomas Mudge at Bayfordbury Mansions in 1761, which goes to show that he must have been held in high esteem if he was attracting customers such as Mudge. You can see from the design of the frame that it is the same as the others he made at Crowtherswell Alley workshop, with a tulip-shaped forged into the corner post. But another trait I associate with the clocks of Aynsworth Thwaites are the hour pipe, or should I say the lack of a pipe for the hour hand. I would suggest this was an easier way to support the front and back bearings of a minute rod than trying to fabricate from iron sheet or source a tube of the correct diameter. Another interesting point to notice in his development of his turret clocks is his move from count wheel controlled striking to rack and snail controlled striking. To my knowledge, he was the first clockmaker to use this in turret clocks. Perhaps it was just to be different, or to stop people from caring for the clock from setting the striking incorrectly. But the design stuck and was used by Thwaites and Reed right up into the 1880s. But one thing which cannot be seen in this image is the horizontal lenticular pendulum bob, which we're all very familiar with on the Tompion clocks in the octagonal room at the Royal Observatory, and you don't find many turret clocks with that on. Another very interesting example of his early work is the redundant clock at Morven House, Potter's Bar. Sadly, somebody has removed the handset dial. But the clock has some very interesting features which were unique to Aynsworth. The first is his recoil escapement. This is a very early example of the pallet frame, which has been skeletonized, but the design remained the same all the way through Aynsworth's career and was still being used by Thwaites and Reed some 90 years later. The other development was, which he only used for a few of his clocks, but I thought was very, very clever, was the use of the second arbor of the striking train as the winding jack. This gave a reduction to the barrel, which made it easier to wind the heavy striking weight. So this is the second arbor with the winding square on. I think you can work that out. And the next slide shows the back of that. You can see the wheel with the lifting pins in and the ratchet at the back. He stopped using this method around 1775 and developed a winding engine, which I think we are all familiar with. A very simple device to use by slipping it onto the winding square and allowing the extended arm to rest on the wooden frame onto which the clock movement was fitted would give you a reduction, making the winding, as before, a lot easier. However, you'd need to turn it a lot more times. In 1762, Aynsworth took on his oldest son, Benjamin Thwaites, as an apprentice, without doubt, with having great plans of succession, but sometimes things don't go as planned. And this was very much the case, as 2 years later, in 1764, on the 25th of August, Aynsworth's new workshops were destroyed by a fire, and he wasn't insured. This was reported in the papers on September the 21st, 1764, and I quote, "Whereas it been humbly represented to the King that on Saturday the 25th of August last, between the hours of 1 and 2 in the morning, a fire broke out in the workshops of Aynsworth Thwaites of Rosamond Row in the parish of St. James's, Clerkenwell, which totally consumed the same. Clockwork, finished or nearly so, and also with a great variety of working tools, engines, and other expensive utensils in the trade, and there is no reason to apprehend the said workshop was wilfully and maliciously set on fire by some persons unknown. His Majesty, for the better of discovering and bringing to justice the persons concerned for this wicked crime, is hereby pleased to promise his most gracious pardon to any one of them, except the principal person concerned therein, who shall discover his or her accomplice or accomplices in the same fact, so that he, she, or they may be apprehended and convicted thereof. Signed, great name, Dunk Halifax." The next article continued, and as further encouragement, the said Aynsworth Thwaites and other inhabitants of Rosamond Row, Clerkenwell, do hereby promise a reward of £40 to the person making such a discovery as foresaid, to be paid by Joseph Brain, Churchwarden of St James's, Clerkenwell, on the conviction of every one or more of the offenders. And that signed Aynsworth Thwaites. But Aynsworth Thwaites had friends, good friends who rallied around him, some of them very important members of the horological trade, who on his behalf appealed to people throughout the local area and imagined the horological world to get Aynsworth back up and running, to the extent that this card was produced. Oh, look at that. It mainly repeats what was said in the papers, with a few tugs on the heartstrings in mentioning his 4 young children, but it does give you the impression that he was a worthy and honest man. You'll see that the 2 clockmakers mentioned are Justin Vullamy, near St James's Gate, Pall Mall, John Ellicott, watch and clockmaker at the Royal Exchange, both of which we know Aynsworth manufactured clocks for. So you could say they had a vested interest in seeing him up and running as quickly as possible. And he did. He did get up and running very quickly, as by the 7th of January 1765, about 16 weeks after the fire, we can see in the Sun and Royal Exchange insurance that he had covered himself for the sum of £1,200. The words horse and bolted can't help but spring to mind, in my opinion. The information in the insurance cover gives us an indication of what his workshops and dwellings consisted of at the time. It reads, on the household goods, utensils, stock, goods in trust, in his now dwelling house, only bricks situated at the forestead, not exceeding £370. Wearing apparel, only not exceeding £70. Shop room over behind brick timber, not exceeding £130. And interestingly, his utensils, stocks, goods, and trust therein only not exceeding £630, more than the value of his house, etc., etc., making a total of 1,200. Just before the fire, on the 18th of September 1763, an order was placed for this clock. And this is the one I've mentioned already, is St Michael's Church, Charleston, South Carolina, which I've already mentioned. The said chimes are as Edward Stratton clock of 1671 that first sounded out from the tower in the Royal Exchange in the City of London. We know from our records, or from the records still held at the church, that the Aynsworth specification and costs were as followed. A strong 30-hour clock to show the hours 4 ways, to strike the hour on the largest bell and the quarters on 4 bells as the Exchange London. In a strong iron frame, the great wheels to be 20 inches in diameter and the rest in proportion. The pinions hardened with ropes, pulleys, hands and package, £120. 4 copper dial plates of 6-foot diameter with strong iron rings and bolts with nuts and screws, painted and gilded in the best manner and packaged for the sum of £74. The 8 bells were cast by Leicester and Packer, later to become Whitechapel, at a cost of £581, over 4 times the cost of the clock. Around the 20th of March in 1764, the clock and the bells were loaded upon the ship, the Little Carpenter, and set sail to Charleston. Aynsworth then continued to make more clocks, as we know, and in 1765 he made this wonderful quarter clock for Mudge and Dutton, installed at Croom Court, Worcestershire. It is a delight, only measuring 2 foot 6 inches in height, 3 foot 6 inches wide, and 1 foot 6 inches deep, with Aynsworth recoil escapement impulsing a 6 foot 6 inch pendulum. The ornamental dial was designed by the celebrated architect Robert Adams. The place has been converted into flats, and I'm given to understand the clock is still there, but I don't know if it's working or not. In 1767, he exported another clock to the Royal Naval Dockyards in Nova Scotia. And 3 years later, Benjamin Thwaites was freed from the Clockmakers Company, and 2 years later, his younger brother John Thwaites was bound to his father Aynsworth. So the dynasty of the family started to develop. In 1775, we have an example of another of his clocks at Aynsworth, with the second arbor winding, as can be seen on the left-hand side. And another one of 1775, or around that period, is this one from St Oswald's Church. I really like the photograph of this because it shows that they've got a rope weight line, and I would hazard a guess that it's never had a wire rope on it and is working as it was originally designed. And this one also has the second arbor winding. However, a year later, he had moved away from that and had gone to using a winding jack in the corner. And perhaps this is because it wasn't strong enough. The same applies to this clock, which is the Clapham Parish Church of the same year. And I think, for whatever reason, he abandoned the second arbor winding. Sadly, this clock was converted by Dents in the 70s, I think, and the barrels were removed. We recently had it in the workshops and changed it to wind off the barrel arbors rather than the second arbors, which Dent had really done. There's little doubt that he produced many more turret clocks during this period, but sadly I've not found many of them, and they've either been replaced or destroyed. We now come to perhaps the richest vein of information we have in respect to the production of Aynsworth Thwaites. This is his day books in the Guildhall Library here in the City of London, which starts from 1780 and run all the way through up into the early 20th century. I'm sure they are familiar to many of you, and I think we are very lucky to have them still in existence, as they give us an insight into the horological workshop from that period of time and a better glimpse into the working life of Aynsworth Thwaites. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to see the daybook, this is a sample of one of the pages, and from the very detailed information you'll also notice that the costs are included, but in code. And this is the code. It's very simple. It's based on his name. And so if you had AY lowercase b RN, that would be equal to £120, 7 shillings and 3pence. The records give us the names of the clockmakers he did work for, and it reads like a who's who of the horological world at the time. They include Vulamy, Ellicott, Cummins, Dwyerhouse, Green, Dutton, Fitter, Harrison, William Harrison, just to name a few. Companies such as the East Indian Company, who he did considerable amount of work for, including making new domestic clocks, cleaning and repairing domestic clocks, supplying new turret clocks, and servicing old ones. He was still servicing and repairing the clock at St Paul's Cathedral, with details of the repairs entered into the daybooks. He was working for the Board of Ordnance and for Trinity House. His output of turret clocks varied over the years, but his production of domestic clocks seemed to have been his bread and butter work. To give you an insight into his production, I've taken a rough average of the different types of work he undertook over a 10-year period. Manufacture of new turret clocks averages about 6, repairs of turret clocks 30 jobs a year, manufacture of new domestic clocks 15, repairs and servicing of domestic clocks 60, and watch repairs about 3. So he did the whole shebang. For me, as a turret clock conservator, the day books give me a great insight into the repair work or alterations that have been undertaken to the turret clocks during their lifetime. And I find it quite incredible that he was making on average 6 turret clocks a year. Sorry for my dog's just joined us. Over the 30 years we have been in business, we have made 2 turret clocks, and each one took at least 10 weeks to make, and that's with modern machinery. Two examples come to mind. Firstly, the Langley-Bradley clock of St Margaret's, Westminster, which happens to be on our workshops, where on the handset dial you can be seen a record of the work undertaken. And here's the handset dial. And you'll notice if there's the recent one of 2008 to 2009, but you'll see one there, repaired by Thomas Bray, 1781 and 1802. And if we go into the day books, and on the 13th of March 1780, you'll find this entry: cleaned a 30-hour clock and chimes at St Margaret's, Westminster, a new fly pinion to the quarter part, new pins to the quarter wheel, a new nib on the locking detent, 2 friction rollers on the dial work, and move the dial pinion, put a tooth into one of the dial works. And because we had the clock in the workshop, we will be able to look and see the fly pinion, which he made, that these are the 2 lifting pins he's discussing in the in his day book, and this is the locking detent that he added a new nib for. For me and my colleagues in the workshop, this gives us a direct connection not only with the clockmaker Langley-Bradley, but also to Aynsworth Thwaites and his workmen and his workshops, making you feel part of something much bigger and a duty to undertake your work so it lasts for the next 238 years. Another example is a clock we saw on the last AHS London tour, which was this clock at St Mary's, Warnoff. The frame has many of the characteristics of clocks made by the Lennon-Tennant school of clockmaking from around 1620, but it is evident that it is being converted from end to end to side by side trains, and the proudly engraved on the handset dial is the following. Not a brilliant photograph. Repaired and minutes added in 1786 by Aynsworth Thwaites. And if we look in the day books again on the 12th of July 1786, we get to see much more detail, which helps us identify other work, other Aynsworth clocks for which we didn't have so much information. In that day book, it describes how he repaired a 30-hour clock, he fitted a new swing wheel, added new pallets and a pendulum, repaired the chimes, stopped up the pivot holes, new centre wheel and arbor, new contrate wheel, rods and bearers, and this entire set of dial motion works. He even went on to make a new set of hammers, new lines, new pulleys. He redid the dials. You can see the minute hand is unusual. I think that was the original hour hand. He re-gilded the dials. He did the carved work around on the clock case, so it says. Really, you'd think it'd have been easier to make a complete new clock. However, there's one secret the clock had kept for many years, and that is when you remove the handset dial, like the one on the Herbert clock, on the reverse, you see the handset dial for a single-handed clock. Some may say, again, it's to save money. Others that he was showing as respect to the original clockmaker. Perhaps at the end of the day, it was a bit of both. There is a very important date which is covered within this period, and it's the death of Aynsworth Thwaites' first son, Benjamin, in 1789. John had been freed from the Clockmakers' Company in 1782, and I'm sure Aynsworth must have had in mind that he wouldn't be long before his sons would be eventually running the company and allowing him to perhaps retire after his long and successful career. But before I dilate on what happened, I would like to discuss one of the very important clocks, one where the dates have been somewhat misquoted and with which the day books have helped us correct. And that clock is the one at the Greenwich Hospital. The hospital was designed by Christopher Wren and built between 1696 and 1712 for the relief and support of seamen serving on ships belonging to the Royal Navy who had become incapable of further service at sea and being unable to maintain themselves. In 1704, Langley Bradley supplied a clock and installed it in the East Dome at a cost of £35. Davis of Windsor gave an estimate for a new clock in 1754, but we don't know if that was fitted. But in January 1779, a serious fire destroyed the chapel, and I was under the impression that the new clock was installed then. But it would appear that this was not the case, as in May 1780, Aynsworth quotes John Holmes, the clock and watchmaker, who had the contract at the hospital, for making new dials and motion work to show the minutes and cleaning a 30-hour clock, along with other works relating to the clock installation. It wasn't until the 18th of June 1785 that John Holmes places an order with Aynsworth for a very unique clock that is still up in the tower at Greenwich Hospital. There are several eminent characters involved in this clock, such as the famous civil and mechanical engineer John Smeaton and the Reverend William Ludlam, the mathematician and astronomer. In Thomas Reed's book, A Treatise of Clock and Watchmaking, published much later in 1819, the appendix include correspondence between Holmes, Smeaton and Ludlam regarding this clock, and we get an insight into the reasoning behind the design, which is quite interesting. Both Smeaton and Ludlam were aware of the clockmaker Henry Hindley, and this is one of his clocks, who they refer to as Father Hindley, and his use of a double frame as seen in this slide, and encouraged Holmes to use this design. There's much more advice in the letters, including the use of Hindley's compound pinions and that the escape wheel should be at least an inch thick, and all of these were incorporated into the design, and the following order was placed with Aynsworth. A new 8-day turret clock with 2 great wheels to show 2 outside dials, hands and minutes. The shape of the frame accordingly to orders as to make the pinion arbors all shorter than the barrel arbors, so a double frame, with lantern pinions in brass frames, with double striking works after the manner of Mr. Hindley. The escapement after drawings of Mr. Smeaton, with a thick swing wheel made of brass and tin, gunmetal, £120. Clean the clock over to preserve it. This is the interesting part. To 5 years shop room and polishing of wheels, pinions and all work before it is fixed, £15, and a new winding engine. So it appeared that it was stored for 5 years. And here it is. Aynsworth, Thwaites, Aynsworth, Thwaites, Hindley. So when he made this clock, it was put into his workshop, and it seems like it wasn't installed till 1790. And I think it does. I think this proves, and it's another example, how the day books give us clarification over a very important clock. The escape wheel, as can be seen here, the 1-inch thick escape wheels proposed and would have had eye-gate pallets that recall, but are dead in larger pendulum marks. Holmes wrote that he could not afford eye-gate pallets, so they were hardened steel instead. The beat adjusting screws on the pendulum bear onto a steel crutch. Again, eye-gate was suggested as a bearing surface, but not used. A 2 seconds pendulum was employed with a wooden box and a sphere as a bob. A small auxiliary bob is used for regulation, as again can be seen. The double suspension spring is intended to reduce the pendulum's tendency to weave. Ludlam wrote that the pendulum should be bolted to a rock as big as the hospital. You'll see a wooden case protects the pendulum from drafts, and inside the case you can just see the signature of James Watt, 1797. This slide shows the construction of the pinions used by Hindley, and something that actually was taken up by Aynsworth on some of the clocks that he manufactures later in his career. And you can see how you've got the brass cage with the hardened steel inserts and the rings which hold them into place. A good way of producing a very accurate pinion relatively easily, and a large pinion. Aynsworth never made any other clocks to the double frame design, or I don't know of any. And it would be interesting to know what he thought of it, something we will never know. But it wasn't just turret clocks and domestic clocks that Aynsworth made. On the 9th of February 1781, he made a lathe for Mr. Ellicott. He made numerous wind dials. He even, in 1783, made pinions for a crane. On the 9th of September, is reported that he made a copper frame for Mr. Aubert. I had no idea what he made the copper frame for. On the 6th of October, 1784, he repaired a weighwiser for Mr. Cummings. Yeah, this is a device I'm sure you know for measuring distance. He supplied a grinding wheel to Mr. Aubert. In the day books he cuts numerous swing wheels, normal wheels, Worman wheels, weight lines and pulleys. He undertook vast amounts of organ work for Mr. Cummings, along with supplying him with turret and domestic clocks. Interesting, Cummings settled his bill at the end of each year. All this goes to show that he must have had a very well-equipped workshop and a large and well-skilled workforce. Aynsworth was a liveryman of the Clockmakers Company, but never made it onto the court and never became master. This is something his son John would go on and do, but for whatever reason, it was not to be for Aynsworth. But I move on from this part of my story. Before I move on to this part of the story, I do need to address the production of domestic clocks, which we are aware were many in number. And I'm sure there are many of you who worked on several examples. But for me, in my field, it's not the case. However, I am aware that they are good quality. And this is an example of one I was given these photographs of, showing you again that it was high quality. This is by Aynsworth and John. Anyway, that's enough of the domestic stuff. So let's go back to 1789 and the death of Aynsworth Thwaites' oldest son, Benjamin, at the age of 42 years. As I alluded to before, this must have come as a complete shock and a cause of major readjustment in the family firm. In 1790, at the age of 33, John Thwaites went into partnership with his father. And it was during this period of the long case, same as the long case I've just shown you, that we start to see turret clocks produced. So they continue to produce turret clocks to a very similar design as they did in the years before, like this one at Hadlow in 1794. But you find these signed Aynsworth and John Thwaites, Clerkenwell. In 1792, they made a clock with a gridiron pendulum for the University College, Oxford. Sadly, I've been unable to see this clock, but from Aynsworth and John's specification, it sounded very, very interesting. And it had a gridiron pendulum of zinc and steel fixed to the wall with a shifting cock on the front to adjust the hanging of the pendulum. I'm quite interested to see that because you know, for a clock of 1792 to have a turret clock, to have a gridiron pendulum, that's quite an interesting thing. In 1793, the beginning of 1793, there is a change in the handwriting. Perhaps this was the year John started to take control of the company, either because Aynsworth was aging or starting to retire. In 1794, the day books start on the 1st of January up until the 11th. There is a gap of 4 days until the 15th when they start again. Aynsworth had been buried at St James's Church, Clerkenwell, on the 12th. John continued the business and took on his one and only apprentice, George Jeremiah Reed. And it was in that year of 1794 that clocks started to appear signed John Thwaites, as this one of Ham Park, West Sussex. In 1813, we see the first clock signed John Thwaites and Co. at Merton College, Oxford. Then, interestingly, in 1815, we find this clock from Whitechapel School, the first clock signed Thwaites and Reed, London. The foundation date is often quoted for the company Thwaites and Reed as 1820, but this clock proves that to be wrong, and that it is 1815. In 1816, George Reed is freed from the Clockmakers Company, having already been in partnership with John for a year. Thwaites and Reed would go on to become famous throughout the world and become one of the biggest producers of turret clocks as well as domestic clocks for the rest of the 18th century, continuing on to this day. A fantastic legacy for one hardworking and very honest man, Aynsworth Thwaites. Thank you very much.
So that's good. I can say thank you, Keith. That was really great and really successful. It must have been awful for you to talk to an empty room. So you did really well. Yeah, I bet. We were all happy. It was really lovely. Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for coming.